ICOR's April webinar entitled The Impact of National Cultures on Resilience Programs. Just as a reminder, all of our webinars are available on our webinar page of our website, thebuildresilience.org, and you can view those again after the presentation if you would like. I'd like to introduce today Dr. A.J. Briding. The Impact of National Cultures on Resilience Programs was developed by Dr. A.J. Briding. Dr. Briding was the first person to be certified as an ICOR Certified Organizational Resilience Expert, CORE, and is a consultant in organizational resilience, continuity of operations, and emergency management. A.J. brings over 30 years of field experience in leading operations in VUCA, or volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environments around the globe. He has lived in Libya, Japan, Egypt, Israel, and Germany, and has flown missions as an Air Force transport pilot into 40 countries, including international disaster relief and humanitarian assistance operations. A.J. was in the field as a United Nations truce supervisor in Lebanon, Israel, and the Sinai Peninsula, and traveled throughout Syria, Jordan, Israel, and Egypt. He is the president of Vantage Solutions, LLC, that provides consulting and education services, and he also serves as an advisor and trainer for ICOR. A.J. has 7 years of collegiate teaching as a professor of aerospace studies and associate professor of physics, and has been teaching online courses for over 12 years, including a master's degree course in cultural studies for the U.S. Air Force. With that, I'd like to welcome A.J. Briding.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm A.J. Briding. I'm looking forward to presenting this, and certainly if you have any questions during the webinar, please use your question button, and I'll do my best to either answer them as we go or by the conclusion of the webinar. My purpose in today's webinar is simple: to promote an awareness of the impact culture can have in international scenarios, especially those that include crisis planning and actions, if you take that in a general sense. If I succeed in convincing you today that cultures run deep and can affect much more than just how different nationalities might communicate with each other, then my basic goal for this webinar will be met. I'd like to note up front here that I'm using national to represent all general cultures, and that includes ethnic and regional cultures. These are the objectives that we'll be looking at. I think I've pretty much covered them. Western concepts of crisis leadership and management may or may not fit into some of the cultures that I'll be describing. And then there will be some tools that you'll see that can help you bridge those value systems. So let's start out with a poll here. We're going to ask you to select the best answer that describes you, and realize that we only had a few selections that could be listed, so do your best to provide the one that fits you the best.
So it looks like for today's webinar, A.J., that 100% of the people attending today are looking they're from North America, the Western culture.
Okay, well that's interesting. It's always worthwhile to get the perspectives from other countries in this, especially in the questions. But since I'm American, and since what I am trying to convince other Westerners about, I think having everyone here from Western or from American perspective will be useful. So let's press on and see if I can make my argument. So let's start with what is culture and why is it important? Cultural perspectives, biases, worldviews, personal characteristics, frames of reference. That sounds pretty chaotic, but current research is presenting models to reduce some of that complexity. The bottom line here is that it is indeed all a matter of perspective. and some of that perspective is hardwired into people. So let me throw this out there. I took this map orientation from a comment made by one of the researchers, Gert Hofstede, in his book about cultures and organizations. And this is a map as might be presented from a New Zealand and Australia perspective. It's a great way to start to shake you out of your normal frame of reference. Notice that the map represents a different yet still accurate way of looking at things. The oft-quoted Chinese general Sun Tzu recommended that you understand both yourself and your enemy. I would suggest that it's more important here on my subject today to understand who you work with. I'm going to show you 3 different quotes that help to illustrate the concept of perspective. These quotes are worth thinking about, and they're a good introduction to cultural complexity. This first one points out that we may think the country we're visiting is foreign, but people in the country are looking at us as being foreign. This second one here is one of my favorite quotes. It's from Abdul Ali Khan, and it emphasizes that nationality might provide only a superficial sense of identity, and that can easily be overcome by much stronger underlying identity. And then I like to throw this one in. It certainly will make sense to the audience today, different strokes for different folks. It's unattributed, but it captures, I think, the mix of the way the mix of the immigrant cultures that makes up the American populace have mostly blended into our own unique American culture. And it's very tolerant of different ways of looking at things. To start defining culture, let's start with this one from Peterson, one of the researchers that I like to use in my presentations. If you scratch the surface of most people, this is what you'll find. Stable values and beliefs that differ from those of other groups. Now let me throw in a second one. And this is from Gert Hofstede. Culture consists of the unwritten rules of the social game. A different way of looking at it, but very accurate. And he titled his book Software of the Mind. And I think that's an excellent analogy. It says your mind is programmed, and it reacts according to that program. And the program starts with your environment and training at birth. Final one here is a Moroccan proverb. It reinforces the concept that cultural programming starts from the beginning of life and is ingrained into it. As you look at this slide, it's important to understand that there are many layers to cultures around the world, starting with the very broad grouping of the major civilizations down to each of the component ethnic and religious subgroups within those civilizations. Samuel Huntington found enough significant differences to identify the Western, the Russian Orthodox, the Islamic, the African, Latin American, the Semitic, the Hindu, the Buddhist, and Japanese cultures, all as distinct civilizations. Notice the influence of religion in characterizing some of this. Ethnic and geographical distinctions will further subdivide these civilizations. So why is that important? We're becoming more of a global society every day, as we all understand. And we're bringing different cultures together on a working basis with greater frequency. And many institutions and companies will be spread over multiple countries. Value systems and general traits common to different countries tend to surface in ways that often lead to misunderstanding and ineffectiveness. That ineffectiveness will become more severe in the high pressure and high tempo of emergency and continuity operations. Keep in mind that the more you're under stress, the more you revert to your basic characteristics. I would suggest that at this level, Huntington's concept of the clash of civilizations that he predicts will reduce to the clash of operational paradigms. And those differences due to cultural expectations and norms can undercut the best laid plans if they're not taken into account. that basically captures the points that I think emphasize why culture needs to be studied, especially in this context. So let's do another baseline poll here. How good do you think what I would call your cultural savvy is? How well do you understand and can you operate comfortably in foreign cultures?
Well, here it's interesting that we're getting kind of a combination of things. We have very much, let's see, 50% said okay, 21% said good, and then poor and excellent were both split at 14%. So sort of an even ranking with most of the people voting okay, and then the rest voting pretty much equally across.
Okay. All right. Well, let's compare that with what we get down the road here. So let me get into some of the points that I think are so important. And cultural dissonance, obviously, is the underlying theme. Let me look at a few Proverbs, because I enjoy studying Proverbs as they provide a window into the soul of the culture. Some of these are Proverbs, some are simply common sayings, but they convey messages worth consideration. Here I highlighted business before pleasure. Has anyone gone overseas and experienced cultural dissonance about that? Many nationalities will tend to build relationships first, and that can take anywhere from hours to days before you actually get down to business. For Westerners, for us Americans, that can be very disturbing, upsetting, chasing. We want to get in and get started. But if you try to skip this, you can create upset and mistrust that will undercut your business intentions. Now, let me throw these in. Mumkin bukra, inshallah. Maybe tomorrow, God willing. God's time is the best time. Patience is the key which solves all problems. A culture with a highly linear orientation towards time, such as Westerners bring, sees that as a limited commodity to be used efficiently towards completion of tasks, problem solving, or coming to an agreement. If you're a project manager, you practice this every time you put together a project plan with timelines for tasks. You neatly group those serially or in sequence, and all of that is to provide a schedule. That's a key measure of performance. In contrast, these last three Proverbs illustrate that other cultures may operate on something called event time versus our clock time. They view the passing of hours and days as cyclical, with one event leading into another, undefined or uncontrolled by timelines. Punctuality is not part of their picture, and as unscripted events pop up, such as meeting old friends, that can take precedence over planned events. So let's summarize so far. Cultures concern different mannerisms and traits. They also concern values and thought processes. And it's not just how we interact. It goes much deeper. On mannerisms, consider how one society may simply prefer graciousness rather than boldness, how they might have specific expectations on how people are greeted. You may find that direct eye contact is rude and may prefer to be very discreet in how they communicate. On values, consider how religion can form cultural norms and how societies have different standards for the role of women, expectations of physical courage, and whether success or the family is more important. And let me point out here that even Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which seems to be a cornerstone of everybody's philosophy, that presents an ethnocentric Western value system. Maslow is Western. He used his Western viewpoints and values as a bias point for what he came up with. And it should be modified to reflect the value system of other cultures, and there is significant research on that. For example, the order of levels of this hierarchy would change, and the values prevalent in collectivist cultures, such as harmony or family support, do not appear in the hierarchy he presents. And thought processes, think about how Westerners assume that Aristotelian logic drives rational thought. It's just the way we're brought up. It's all our education. You start with a premise. You do your hypothesis. You do if A then B type of thought. That's not necessarily the standard in other cultures, and this took me quite a while to get used to. Some thought processes are driven by emotion. To include faith and honor, and they use nonlinear associations to come to conclusions. Does yes mean yes? Hold that thought for the next slide. Honor and faith. I'd like to mention here how important honor and faith can play in your interactions, and this can be a showstopper, literally, if not handled well. If your comments come across as an affront to a person, especially if made in a public setting, in some societies, that person will take that very personally and react emotionally. At that point, it's all about damage control, and prevention is so much better than trying to effect a cure for that. Mastery and fatalism. We are a very mastery-oriented society in America. But fatalism can be so ingrained in some cultures that even well-educated and trained people will tend to let actions take their own course and prefer not to try and shape the future. Confrontation avoidance. I'll discuss that as a factor in upcoming slides, but it can be a very important factor that you need to be aware of. So hold on to that thought for a little bit longer here, and we'll get more into that. All of this illustrates that as you work with people from other cultures, the problem is that you may be thinking apples, they may be thinking oranges, and the disconnect may or may not be apparent. Here's a thought from Mark Twain that certainly has summed up my feelings going into different cultures until I sorted things out. Okay, let's get back to that when yes means no. It's a very good example of how culture shock can hit you. Here's the saying that was provided by an African student. I'll give you a moment to read it. And now let's look at this one from Japan. I've run into this myself multiple times when I lived in Japan, and it's reflected in other Asian and African cultures in particular. First quote is from an African student, and then this was out of a Japanese website on the second. So think about how someone can tell you one thing and do another, but these responses are driven by culture, not by what a Westerner might think are just simply weak personal characteristics, undependability, that type of thing. It's much deeper than that. Okay, let me see how many of you might have experienced what I would term culture shock. And I'm looking for an experience that upset your norms of behavior enough to make you feel significantly uncomfortable, or you've had that moment of not being able to simply process what is happening. It doesn't make sense. It shatters your mental framework.
You know, AJ, while people are thinking about this and voting, I wanted to share a couple of things that I've experienced that just reading those two quotes that you had a minute ago, kind of, I wish I had known that beforehand. So ICOR was running what we thought was going to be a joint conference in Kenya, and the way to pay for that conference was going to be by having some exhibitors come and also have some sponsors come so they could come in and talk about their products and services. And one of the things that was really interesting was in all of the planning stages, I was responsible for planning the program, for getting everything ready to get the speakers and that kind of thing. And my local partner, our training partner there, was responsible for getting the sponsors and different companies to talk about their products and services. And it wasn't, we thought everything was going great until we got there and we found out that there were no sponsors and there were no companies speaking. All the way along, we've been told everything's fine, everything's fine. But I think now I have an understanding that they didn't want to tell me that no, they weren't going to do that, that wasn't something they felt comfortable with. So I just made an assumption when we kind of delegated out duties of what would make sense, and maybe I would have asked some more questions versus making an assumption in my delegations. I also was teaching it was embarrassing to me, and I think it was embarrassing to them, and it created a situation that if I'd understood better, I probably wouldn't have set it up that way.
I think that the one experience that finally made me understand that there were dynamics at work that didn't fit with my upbringing and my expectations was when I was working in the Middle East in the United Nations with the UN Truth Supervision Organization, monitoring the peace in the countries around the Israeli borders. And part of that was the Sinai Peninsula, and I lived in Cairo for 6 months. And that Mumkin Bukra, inshallah, after I heard that about a dozen times, I started thinking, what's going on here? And it seemed like nothing would ever get done. You would need water out in one of your stations out in the desert, and you needed it within a day or two. The Arab expediters would say, yeah, Mumkin Bukra, maybe tomorrow, God willing, and it might take a week to get it. And at first I just thought, man, they're lazy around here. And then I started realizing, wait a second, this is a cultural artifact. This is something that is ingrained into them, that it's not important that time is event time, that things will happen when it happens, fatalistic attitude. And then suddenly I realized that everything I had been using to evaluate how to act probably needed to be reevaluated. And that started me on this course of cultural study and applying it to actual operational situations. So how did the poll turn out?
So it looks like we have 60% of the people here have experienced mild culture shock, 20% haven't received any significant, 13 have experienced a significant culture shock, and 7% don't really have any experience with other cultures, so they pretty much couldn't vote on this. And that's really interesting. I wanted to share one more story that I shared with you yesterday, AJ, which was I was teaching a class in the Philippines, and the attendees in the class were from all of Southeast Asia. And I had created an interactive course where we were going to do a lot of small group work, a lot of reporting, a lot of interaction, I thought, between myself as the instructor and the participants. And after like 4 hours, I realized that no one was talking. And so I talked with the leadership of the event, and they explained to me that I was the expert, that number one, no one would ask me any questions because they would feel that would be rude. If they asked me a question, it would be a challenge of my expertise, and therefore they would not ask questions because I kept trying to confirm that they understood what I was talking about. And secondly, people did not want to share what we were doing in the small group work because they felt that it was sharing either weaknesses in their organization, and part of the issue was that they wanted to always look good. And secondly, that same sort of unease about speaking in front of a group of people. And so what I ended up doing for the rest of the 2.5 days was to having somebody volunteer to be a spokesperson, also to share the information from the group, and also for people to write their questions down on paper and give them to me, and then I could answer their questions without saying who they came from. And so that was the way I had to work around trying to deliver what I thought was a quality course using a methodology that works very well in North America that wasn't working well for me in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, that's another good example, and I'll touch on some of that as we go along here, why that comes about. I would love to hear about those significant culture shocks. So unfortunately, I'll just have to let those go by. But there's some great stories out there about some of the things that shake you out of your complacency.
Yeah, if you want to share something, you can use the question pane. We had a person share that a professor once told her that before you begin to deal with other countries in business, you should always research their cultures to help bridge that gap, so that making sure that you're communicating and working with them effectively. So if you have anything else you want to share, go ahead and use the questions button, and I'll share it as we go.
Well, that comment steals some of my thunder, but that's good. So, okay, let's. How do you assess cultural attributes? Some of the things that you mentioned there, Linda, and some of the things that might be going through your mind can actually be assessed to a degree that helps you better anticipate what might be coming at you. And there's been a lot of study in the last several decades, some good solid research. And two of the sources that I like are here, Cultural Dimensions, that provide scales that compare areas where the researchers found commonalities within groups. And then the same with Peterson scales, Brooks Peterson presenting them. So we'll take a look at those. But realize these are scales and studies that identify a central tendency of a given society or culture. And they no way imply that there's a cultural stereotype you can depend on. Like any distribution of traits, you're going to find a central tendency. You're also going to find variance. And you're going to find outliers. So you can't put this on individuals so much as you can on a collective group, and you get insights that give you something that starts estimating what to expect. So let's get into Hofstede's dimensions, which I really enjoy applying. And you can go to his website if you Google cultural dimensions, Hofstede cultural dimensions, you'll find it. And he has evaluated a large number of nations and provides his and his researchers ratings for these different 6 indicators here. And that's one of the reasons I like to use national, because a lot of the studies do group by national characteristics, even though they may be shared by nations close by as well. So these 6, power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, and indulgence are what he came up with as commonalities quite often to define characteristics of culture. So power distance is about inequality in society. It's the degree to which less powerful members of the society will accept and expect that power is distributed unequally. It's fine with them, and that's the way life is. In high power distance cultures, you accept the hierarchical order in which everybody has a place and which needs no further justification. Obviously, that wouldn't fit well for Americans. Individualism versus collectivism. A high score for this measure indicates a preference for a loose-knit social framework, and individuals are expected to take care primarily of themselves and their immediate families. At the low end of this scale is collectivism, where the norm is a tightly knit framework in society where one expects their relatives or members of a particular in-group to look after them, and in exchange they provide unquestioning loyalty. This boils down essentially to the concept of whether your self-image is defined in terms of I or we. And for Americans, obviously, we would be we'd be very high on individualism. The high end of the masculinity scale. Now, be careful when you first hear masculinity and femininity, you bring up Western concepts of that, but this is distinctively different. The masculinity scale denotes a preference in society for achievement, heroism, assertiveness, and material rewards for success. And society in masculine cultures will generally be competitive. A low score represents the femininity side, and that is a preference for cooperation, modesty, caring for the weak, family, quality of life. Uncertainty avoidance represents the degree in which members of a society feel uncomfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity, and how society deals with the fact that the future can never be known. A basic question for this scale is whether a society would prefer to control the future or simply let it happen. And obviously, fatalism factors into that. Additionally, strong uncertainty avoidance mandates rigid codes of belief and behavior, as well as intolerance of unorthodox behavior and ideas. Weak uncertainty avoidance basically describes societies that maintain a more relaxed attitude, and practice counts more than principles. So if you want to avoid uncertainty, you define the way people should act, and you expect no variations off of that. Long-term orientation addresses how a culture maintains links with its own past while dealing with the challenges of the present and future. Societies prioritize these two basically existential goals differently. Societies who score low on this dimension, for example, prefer to maintain time-honored traditions and norms while viewing societal change with suspicion. They don't like to upset the apple cart. Those with a culture that scores high, on the other hand, take a more pragmatic approach. They would encourage thrift and efforts in education, for instance, as a way to prepare for the future. The bottom line here is whether, excuse me, let me see. The bottom line here is how you look at the future and whether you prefer a short-term normative approach or a long-term pragmatic approach. And indulgence is pretty much self-explanatory. It measures whether a society allows relatively free gratification of basic and natural human drives, and looks at enjoying life and having fun, or if it prefers restraint by suppressing gratification of needs and regulates it by means of strict social norms. Now let's look at Peterson scales and see how that compares. You'll notice here that they boil down to, in three of those that are not highlighted, different ways to look at some of Hofstede's dimensions. The ones that are bolded there, direct, indirect, and task relationship, are useful to consider, and they bring out aspects that Hofstede's dimensions do not. So let me see here. I'm having a... Okay, for the hierarchical decision-making, the question is whether decision-making authority and empowerment can be found at the lower levels, or must you learn up to the highest levels? Are organizational personnel on an equal footing, or are there clearly defined roles and authorities? Is self-direction okay, or is top-down direction required? Is it okay to challenge higher-level direction? Is there a political approval requirement beyond the organization? So how you basically rank on that equality versus hierarchy brings out these factors. Now for direct or indirect communications, you look at whether issues are openly confronted or they handled circumspectly and discreetly, and perhaps even avoided. Is dissension or conflict okay, or must be avoided if at all possible? Can you be frank, or must you be tactful? Can you challenge ideas? Is clear, explicit expression the norm, or are things left open for interpretation? And body language to other contexts a key part of the communication? Does yes mean yes? That all falls under direct versus indirect communications. On individual versus group orientation, does the culture improve individual initiative or must gain consensus? Which has priority, the individual or the group? Is it okay to non-conform, or must you always conform to social norms? Which takes precedence, personal or group values? Is there a loose or tight group identity? Relationship or task is a good one to understand here. And that thinks about whether you take care of business first and relationships later, if ever. Or do you establish a mutual trust relationship before getting to business and realize that that could take days? Are your relationships with coworkers on a personal or impersonal level? Do you have a work priority or a family priority? And then risk versus caution looks at whether you make decisions quickly or use slow, deliberate decision making. Do you focus on present and future, exploring the unknown, or on the past? Are you open to trying new and innovative ways, or do you defer to past precedent? Do you prefer fewer rules and regulations, or do you require extensive rules and regulations? Are you comfortable with changing plans or making adjustments, or do you prefer to stick to the plan even when things start to go wrong? So you can see some of those relationships between Hofstede's dimensions and Peterson scales and some of the information they can convey, particularly in a group or cultural setting. So let's take a look at that. Here's Peterson's scales, and I'm going to compare the U.S. with Japan. So if you put the values for the U.S. in, I'm sure this isn't surprising to our audience today. We value equality. We are direct in our communication. Sometimes some would say too direct. We don't worry about hurting people's feelings a lot of times, and tact is not one of our strong suits in general. We are individually oriented as opposed to group oriented for the great part. We are very task-oriented rather than relationship-oriented, and we are comfortable with risk. Sometimes we strike out in risky directions if we think the cost-benefit ratio there is worthwhile. So once again, all of you in the room there can say, well, I don't necessarily fit all that, and individual preferences certainly will vary among Americans, but collectively, that's a pretty good description. So now let's layer in the Japanese values here. Very hierarchical oriented, very indirect in their communications, very group oriented, very relationship oriented, and very cautious. So those are kind of one that baselines the left side and one that baselines the right side of these scales. And if you start thinking about that, you can realize that everything about the two countries is prime for conflict. Japan's culture values a hierarchical order, expects people to know their place. It values confrontation avoidance, using very direct, indirect communication methods to avoid saying no or otherwise being contrary. Japan's society is highly group-oriented, starting with the business or organization. Japan values relationships and conducts much of its personal and business dealings accordingly. It is also risk-averse, preferring the cautious, pre-planned approach over unplanned actions or quick changes, even when things don't start fitting into that plan. So you can certainly see that the conflict that may arise between these two cultures when you attempt to interact between them. So my observations on this would be that these country assessments are just broad generalizations. But again, let me emphasize that they're not intended to stereotype all individuals. But they do give a starting point to help understand the general value systems of a culture. They also suggest that Western-based concepts may not resonate well in other parts of the world, pure and simple. And when you think about how Westerners pretty much set the standards for organizational resilience, emergency response, and all of that, maybe that needs to be looked and modified for different national applications. So all this brings out the strong potential for serious issues to come up when working with other cultures, and not only for us Americans and other Westerners working with, say, Asian or African or other cultures like that, but also between those cultures themselves, such as Asians with Latin Americans or Africans. What influences culture? It's important to understand this so you can start to get an idea where things can be very touchy if you're not careful. 3 prime factors, starting with religions. They can play the dominant role by defining actions and attitudes that their adherents must follow and other actions that are prohibited. So they do proscribe things, and if you are not aware of that and you don't show the proper respect and courtesy, you dress them properly, you're too bold or informal with certain sectors of society, some of those breaches can cause very significant issues. How you treat the Quran, for instance, in Islamic civilizations, those can be showstoppers. They can bring things to a screeching halt. Ethnicities, we read a lot about that, particularly in the way things are going in the Middle East. A lot of ethnic groupings have their own value systems, and they can be another major force behind how people behave and the values they hold. Your ethnicity will often define how you interact with your clientele, how aggressive or direct you are, whether you care to allow face or personal honor to be maintained. And if you don't do that, that can cause a lot of problems and confusion. So there are a lot of things out there that are ethnic factors that you definitely need to be aware of. On modernization and globalization, you have religions that influence, you have ethnicities, and then now with the modernization and globalization that's going on in the world, these can motivate new cultural attitudes and changes, or they can generate cultural resistance. And we saw some of that in the Arab Spring, where urban peoples who were perhaps more receptive to outside influence started to organize and come up with their own value systems, but then the resistance from the established culture that ultimately ended up putting that down. And of course, there's always the political culture and all of that, but there was a major player there. But these can generate just as much resistance as they do change. So some societies do have a strong reluctance to accept new concepts and technology. It's kind of like showing your old grandfather or grandmother some of the new games or iPhone technology, that kind of thing. And some might see them as invasive to a firmly held status quo. So how do you handle all this? First of all, you develop your cultural savvy, and you start by doing your homework. And this goes back to the comments one of the participants today made. Study cultural attributes using the tools available, and use them to understand your own biases and attributes. Know yourself and understand the culture you're going into. These are two little mnemonics that are very useful. And if you can't accept these, you're going to have trouble working within other cultures. Prio, patience, respect. Respect the other culture. It might not match your value system. Understand that it's been there and probably a lot longer than what we've come up with as Americans or European ancestry. Be interested in what's going on around you and be open so that you are receptive and that you can basically process that and work with it. Otis, I don't know if you've heard of the OODA loop, but it's kind of in that sense. You observe, you describe what's going on, so it may not quite mesh up with how you think things should go, but you try and figure out what's happening, and you interpret that, and then you suspend judgment. So be alert, be aware, be open, and start to try and analyze what's going on, and suspend your own value system as you do that. Now, let me put this out to you. I always like this part. You have to build in flexibility, and Linda mentioned that. One size will not fit all, so observe and be innovative. And even more so, the golden rule isn't always so golden. The real rule to follow is what we call the platinum rule. Treat others the way they want to be treated, not how you would want to be treated. Okay, so let's take, I think this is our last full point. So has anything I've presented here changed your assessment of your cultural savvy?
So it looks like our voting, we have over 50% say somewhat, and then the other two very little and significantly or evenly split.
Okay. Well, it sounds like we have a fairly well-informed audience then. That's good. That's encouraging. All right, let's move on so I can wrap this up in the time allotted here. Let's go ahead and start looking at some common concepts in the field of organizational resilience. So these are generally accepted statements common to organizational resilience, and they reinforce the importance of the cultural dimensions. I would stress that organizational cultures will almost always be built upon their underlying national or regional cultures. These are some values that are common throughout organizational resilience programs and standards. These were taken out of actual I-Corps courses. So you want to share authority throughout the organization, and you want to empower subordinates, and you want flexible and shared decision-making processes. How might Hofstede's and Peterson's dimensions affect these qualities? If you think about it, power distance and the hierarchy that are favored in a lot of cultures are factors in all of these. Also consider that collectivism and risk avoidance will work against empowering subordinates. Collectivism works against collegial decentralized authority patterns, and collectivism and risk avoidance certainly work against quick decision making. These are more organizational resilience traits that are expected to be used, especially for crisis operations. Again, it should be apparent that some of these may not easily be accommodated by many other cultures. And some of the points would be that power distance and confrontation avoidance don't work well for open and fast communication. Now, let me also emphasize the importance of face here. How would you see that factoring into these last two bullets? And how might that influence the goals behind the courses of action that are decided? You think that value error reporting is likely if face or conformity and confrontation avoidance are strong values? And what about bucking the hierarchy by putting experts at lower levels, giving them the authority and resources to act? So let me give you a reading here that I did not include. If you noticed at the beginning, I showed a picture from the Fukushima nuclear reactor meltdown caused by the tsunami and earthquakes in Japan. Japan, because of the severity of that, the government initiated a study from an official group to report on what happened, why it happened, and what should be done. In the executive summary of that official government report, let me read this verbatim. For all the extensive detail it provides, what this report cannot fully convey, especially to a global audience, is the mindset that supported the negligence behind this disaster. What must be admitted very painfully is that this was a disaster made in Japan. Its fundamental causes are to be found in the ingrained conventions of Japanese culture, our reflexive obedience, our reluctance to question authority, our devotion to sticking with the program, our groupism, and our insularity. Had other Japanese been in the shoes of those who bear responsibility for this accident, the result may well have been the same. And one other sentence in here also struck me. The consequences of negligence at Fukushima stand out as catastrophic, but the mindset that supported it can be found across Japan. Notice how that reflects how the national culture went all the way down throughout the organizational culture that was responsible for trying to handle the incident. Okay, in summary, these bullets are going to sum up what are the points that I hope to take away from today's seminar. National cultures can be a significant factor. It sounds like all of you well understand that. And that these attributes go far beyond superficial manners. Those attributes include the way people think and the way they feel. and can drive repercussions that are well beyond what you might expect. And when you get into crisis planning and operations, it's interesting. If you go through planning, you develop your plans, you say this is how it should work, and then you go through a tabletop and everyone nods their head, they're doing fine. As Linda mentioned there, what they're saying may be completely opposite from the reality behind that. And then finally, the next step that is to understand the cultures, do your homework, and make sure you understand your own cultural attributes. If you don't know yourself, it's hard to understand why you are not necessarily in congruence with what's going on around you. So that report that I mentioned punctuated all of that I've discussed, and to include how national culture permeates organizational culture and that can work counter to the desired emergency responses. So at this point, we have a few minutes, 10 minutes left, if there are any questions out there.
So AJ, we had one comment from the group that was, he said the most challenging issue from what has been seen in his career has been to promote the BC or business continuity disaster recovery standards globally when the countries that he's speaking with want to use their regionalized standards. And that, getting people to change from what they've been using to use something new and to hold on to what they created versus maybe something that's recognized globally is a challenge. I have seen this working in the ISO world especially. You might even have many representatives from a country helping to write an international standard, and that country then doesn't adopt it, and they hold on to their own, which I find sort of interesting.
And that goes right to the point of this, and what I have seen time and again throughout my experiences overseas. A good example I like to use is that if you look at the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the United Nations is the quintessential international organization. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was put together by the General Assembly and all agreed to. Yet individual countries will take, the same ones that participated, will take exception to that and say, well, your concept of how to treat women doesn't fit with our culture, or your standards of human rights are less important than, say, the security and safety of the country. So there will indeed be this reversion back to we are going to do what we do as a culture. And so what I would say there is you can take two ways of doing that. That's where your innovation and understanding come in. You can try and convert them over to a Western way of doing business, whether it's business continuity or emergency response. And to do that, you're probably going to not get too far unless you bring in bringers from the outside world that can run operations and have the buy-in from the organization to let them run it. Or you can adapt and understand that, well, we may not have a business continuity plan that's going to be as quick and effective, but you just set the more rational standards and meet cultural values. You talk that out with the owners of the processes and the business owners and all of that, and say, what can we agree on? What are the common grounds for the standards you want to achieve? And then apply cultural norms to work backwards from there. But yes, so that is interesting, though. Someone can hire you to come in, put in I-Corps standard business continuity practices, and everyone nods their head and says, yep, this is great, it's all in place, and it falls apart from the first moment you try and invoke it.
So I wanted to give an example of an experience that I had in Thailand. Thailand a couple of years ago experienced some hugely severe flooding, and originally I-Corps started in Asia, and one of our founders was from Bangkok, lived in Singapore, lived in Thailand, lived in Malaysia, all through that area, and he was a great advocate for planning emergency response, for the regions as well as business continuity types of things for the organizations. But it got zero traction. It was, even though we had government support, we had the support of the Asian Development Bank and other of the strong Thai banking areas, it just wasn't seeming to get any traction. And what finally came out at a big conference was that, because remember, in Thailand you're mostly Buddhist, and the idea that you can't change what's going to happen. Whatever is going to happen is going to happen. And so business continuity is a lot about, and emergency management is a lot about trying to stop things from happening. And that just goes against thinking. But what they did see with the flooding is we can't stop the flooding from happening, but we can stop the flooding from hurting us. And so getting that idea across, and that, oh, we can move our buildings away from flood zones. We can put in dams to help move the water from going from one place to another. And that might seem like, kind of an insignificant thought, but the fact is, culturally, this idea that you can't stop what's going to happen is how they live and have lived for thousands and thousands of years. And so I thought that that was really a helpful thing to hear. We have two questions from the audience. One is, can you give some specific examples of how you adjusted your behavior to deal with different cultures to be effective? And how can you solicit honest feedback from a culture that values saving face? And you have about 2 minutes to answer those big questions.
Well, a lot of what I experienced was in my military career, and running disaster relief and military exercises with allies. And Thailand is an interesting case in point. Cobra Gold to do some airdrop with what they considered their elite forces. And our forces come out, they're all geared up. We have very specific standard operating procedures. We load up, and I'm, the pilot of the airdrop aircraft. And the Thai folks come up, they're in their personal clothes. One has a the only thing they had was a parachute that was provided so they could jump out the back. And technically we couldn't allow that, but then I said, we're going to have to suspend our standards. I'm going to take the initiative to do that. I got someone to give us a motorcycle helmet to put on one of the Thais who didn't have a helmet. And we just got on with it. We made the best we could of the situation, and we changed the standards. We changed expectations, but basically we advanced a little bit of interoperability and a little bit of capability development. And what was the second question?
How can you solicit honest feedback from a culture that values saving face?
I think what you have to do is, first of all, most of those saving face cultures depend upon relationships as well. So you establish the relationships, and you get them to trust you, and then you get the back channel feedback. You can work that, and you bring out the importance of it, and you find someone who's influential you can talk to, you develop the relationships, and then you can start making progress. But you've also got to understand that if you design a system like I mentioned there, where you need quick, honest, open reporting and timely decisions, you may have to recalibrate how timely you expect that, who can make those decisions, and you've just got to live with it and realize that you make the best to increase performance parameters, but they may not match what we in the West may be shooting for. So that relationship channel is the way I've found you can get around so much of that confrontation, avoidance, and indirect communication.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to just share that we do have a course that AJ teaches. We have it offered in 2 different ways. It's called The Impact of National Cultures on Resilience Programs. And this course is either offered as an online self-study or also a live e-learning. AJ, can you change the slide to the next one? So it's called OR 4000. And then just to conclude, we do have upcoming webinars that you're welcome to sign up for. May 24th, we'll be talking about organizational resilience certification, and that will be back at our noon Chicago time. And then we'll be moving in June to talking specifically about how to implement the requirements of Business Continuity Standard ISO 22301. In July, we'll be talking about communication strategies. In August, about managing risks to the critical environment, which is looking at data centers and other critical environments. September, we're going to be talking about leadership. October will be more on the IT side about preserving, protecting, and recovering data. November will be about security breaches, and December we'll finish up with building a resilient supply chain. So we thank you for attending today. This webinar will be available for viewing if you'd like to view it again, or if you had to leave early, on the I-Corps webinar page, and it'll be available there for about 30 days, and then it'll be available for our members only. So thank you very much for attending, and have a great rest of the day.